And welcome to Catholics Coast to Coast, where we love to dive right into what's happening at Podcast Central. How's your year going so far? I'm Ace McKay, glad to be a part of your weekends as we do this, as we look at what is the conversations we need to be having with each other, what are conversations we are having with God, and we get to dive deeper into that with podcasts that are streaming anytime, 24/7, either wherever you like to stream podcasts, you can subscribe, or check it out, EWTN.com/podcast, and through the EWTN app, so that way you don't miss future episodes. We always love to start the weekend as we do into the Mass reading, so let's get this week's Word on the Word.
Today, we're going to talk about the second reading. In it, we pick up right where we left off last week in the first letter to the Corinthians.
Remember when we talked about charisms a few weeks ago, that everyone has different gifts of the Holy Spirit? Well, this reading shifts those gifts into focus even more. It says that even if one person has multiple gifts but doesn't have love, then that person has nothing.
Nothing?
Nothing. Nada. Zero. You see, love enables us to use those gifts for God's work, and it even gives faith and hope more meaning.
You know, this is one of my favorite readings personally. Paul explains love is patient, love is kind. We talked about this in Bible study one time, didn't we? Because we substituted our name for the word love, and when you do that, it gives the reading a whole new meaning.
I definitely agree. It was like an examination of conscience. That's what we're going to challenge you to do this week. Read aloud 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 through 7, and replace the word love with your name.
And then ask yourself, is what I'm saying really true? You may be very kind, but are you always patient? If you find yourself lacking in one area, then look for ways that you can grow.
And we'll see you right here next week. Bye.
Toodles.
Reflecting more into the jubilant year as we continue with Year C. You want more Word on the Word? Easy to find when you go to Podcast Central, EWTN.com/podcast, and you can also subscribe wherever you like to stream. I am Ace McKay. As we continue with Catholics Coast to Coast, we've got one of two new podcasts to introduce to you. This one called Counsel of Trent, where this week we're answering the toughest objections against our faith. And this is an entertaining, informative podcast that helps to show how we can share our faith and then also face those who are opposing it. So what are those practical ways? We've got some free-for-all episodes that you can check out, and from a Catholic point of view, how do we change the way we tell our story? We'll dive into it. Brand new, it is Counsel of Trent on this week's Catholics Coast to Coast.
The joy of reading a good book. I've been able to read a lot of good books recently, or I will confess, I've been listening to them more on audiobooks, because when you have little kids, sometimes that's the only way that you can do it. But I'm really enjoying it, so I wanted to talk about that today. And in particular, I wanted to talk about literary point of view, because I've been thinking about it more since I've been reading a wide variety of classic fiction novels recently. So that's what we're going to chat about. Mondays and Wednesdays, we talk apologetics and theology. But on Friday, we talk about really whatever I want to talk about. And today, that's what I want to talk about. Really, for the past 15 years, it's felt like most of the reading and learning that I have been doing has been in the world of nonfiction. I want to do Catholic apologetics. I love helping people learn about their faith, learn about God, learn about the church, learn about Jesus, and answering critics of Catholicism and Christianity, answering people who defend evils like legal abortion or euthanasia. So in order to do that, there are millions and millions of pages out there. Things I couldn't read it in a lifetime. I need 100 lifetimes, if that, to go through all of it. So I've always felt this burden that, okay, I need to learn all these arguments. I got to read journal articles. I have to learn about, and I cover a wide variety of fields in the different subjects that I address. So it might be science and cosmology, philosophy, ancient history, linguistics, languages, European history, American history. All different kinds of issues come up. So I've had to cover a lot of different ground in different areas. And so in that reading, I feel like I've really neglected fiction and classics and just really reading for fun. It is hard. Even when I'm off work, sometimes I feel like, I could read this article, or I could read about this. And there's a sense of guilt, like, I could learn more. But now I feel like the times when I'm not working, it's like, okay, it's time to really dial back. It's time to dial back and save your engine so that you're not experiencing burnout. So I can have time to say, no, I want to just sit back. I don't have to be learning about things 24/7. But honestly, though, one of the best ways to become a really good apologist is not to read nonfiction books over and over and over again. Some of the greatest apologists are people who are well-versed in fiction, in literature, in stories, because they use those analogies and examples when they talk. I mean, one of the best proponents of the new atheism was Christopher Hitchens, right? Hitchens was not a scientist like Dawkins. He's not a philosopher like Daniel Dennett. He wasn't a neuroscientist like Sam Harris, but he was a journalist, a literary critic. And Hitchens was someone that was clearly well-read, widely read, and so he could make allusions and make historical connections that could seem profound to some people, but really were interesting insights. And he did have interesting insights on a wide variety of things. There's a lot of stuff that he got wrong. There's other stuff that he got right, too. But listening to him, you can feel the weight of his arguments more with some of that wider knowledge of things, especially the European canon of literature and things like that. So I think if you want to be a good presenter of the faith and you want to present things to people, not just reading apologetic books, but I mean, think about, Fulton Sheen, for example, or even think of St. Paul. He was able to quote the Greek Stoics, Stoic philosophers and Greek philosophers. Acts 17 records this when he was debating with the Greeks in Athens. So you need to be able to have a wide variety at your hand. And it's just fun. It enriches the soul to read classic literature. So I've been going through a lot of different kinds of classic literature. And when you read a lot of different kinds of books, you'll notice one thing that sets books apart is their point of view. All right. So the different point of view in the story that you're reading. So I want to go through each point of view, discuss its strengths and its weaknesses, and the ones that I tend to prefer, though not exclusively, but the ones that I tend to prefer. So let's start with the points of view. There are really three main points of view and some subsets of some of those points. So the first one would be first person. So first person point of view is you are seeing the world of the novel through the eyes of a particular character. So the words that are used frequently are I. Sometimes it might be we, but typically it's I. I did this, I did that. And it is a person telling you their story, they're experiencing it. They might be telling it in flashback. They might be right in the midst of it, saying it to you. So it's not a retrospective. So classic example of this would be Moby Dick. So the opening of Moby Dick. Call me Ishmael. All right, now we know who you are because he's telling the story from his perspective. He's got to talk to you. Call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse, nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. It's a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses, oh my grim, and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially whenever my hypos get such an upper hand of me, that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking people's hats off, then I account it high time get to sea as soon as I can. And so for the story of Moby Dick, we understand who Ishmael is, and it's through his eyes that we understand, Captain Ahab and his obsession. And of course, when you're writing a story, not just first person, but whose perspective are you going to tell it from? Right? So whose perspective are you going to tell it from? Like Moby Dick would be a lot different if the story were told from Ahab's perspective or the whale's perspective. You could tell it in that way. And this is similar. You look at The Great Gatsby, for example. A lot of people think that Gatsby is the main character of the story, but he's not. Nick Carraway. And so Nick presents everything through his eyes, and it presents the story in a particular slanted view that where Gatsby, if he were telling it to us, it may not be as, I think Carraway in Great Gatsby, when he's telling the story, it is slanted still. Any first person perspective is going to be slanted a bit. Sometimes it's really slanted. And that would be the case of an unreliable narrator. I'll get to that shortly. But in Gatsby, for example, if having Nick there allows us to look at Gatsby and really, see him in a way different than if Gatsby were telling us the story from his eyes, because of course, involving things like, figuring out Gatsby's past and things like that, it wouldn't work. A lot of times first person is used in a story that you'll have someone go in, they're just the regular person. They are the regular person taken along for the journey who doesn't know as much as the other characters, just like we are. This happens in movies too. And so they have to get kind of caught up to speed on things, and then that catches the reader up to speed from that first-person perspective. Another one would be Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. I remember that one. I read that. I should really get back to Dickensian literature. I didn't like it when I was a kid. I don't think I'll still like it now. I think I remember the opening of Great Expectations. It went something like this. My Christian name being Philip, and my English name being Pirip, and my Christian name being Philip, my infant tongue could only sound the name Pip, and hence my name came to be. Just call me Pip. Is that, come on, man. Dickens, I think he wrote by the words. So that's why it can be a bit much to drag through there. So that is one thing that's nice. It gets you right into the heart of it. You have direct access to what the character's thinking. You can really understand them, their thoughts and their feelings without it being cumbersome. Imagine the third person here. We'll get to that. But somebody else saying how Ishmael, when he thinks about killing himself or hurting other people or being a nuisance, he needs to go to sea. So first person works well there. Sometimes, though, first person can be a perspective where you're in the head of some character and you don't really want to be there. You don't like them, or you're just not a fan. So one example of this would be, although a lot of it will reflect on the author's writing style, consider Twilight. It's not a classic, obviously, but it was a very popular book back in the early 2000s by Stephanie Meyer. Twilight's a story about vampires that sparkle in the sun and like to pretend that they're in high school for hundreds of years. I know. So Twilight by Stephanie Meyer, written in 2005. Here's how it opens here. It was to Forks that I now exiled myself, an action that I took with great horror. I detested Forks. I loved Phoenix. I loved the sun and the blistering heat. I loved the vigorous, sprawling city. Bella, my mom said to me, the last of 1,000 times before I got on the plane, you don't have to do this. My mom looks like me, except with short hair and laugh lines. I felt a spasm of panic as I stared at her wide, childlike eyes. But I'm not going to continue on because I can't. I already don't like this person. But also the line, my mom looks like me, except with short hair and laugh lines. That's a meaningless description because at this point, at the beginning of the story, we don't know what Bella looks like. And you guys say, well, you could just imagine. Well, I can't imagine. I would assume that if this is Bella's biological mother, she's going to look like her. I would assume she'd probably look like, you might as well have just said, my mom has short hair and laugh lines. Oh, goodness. So now sometimes the first person, what makes it really interesting is you have an unreliable narrator. So you can use someone who is describing the world, but you might think, oh, wait a minute, the world isn't exactly as how they describe it. They're warping things. They can't be trusted necessarily. Either they're completely lying or they're distorting reality. And that's how a lot of people live, right? They'll think the world is one way when it's actually quite different. And great novels communicate that. One that uses this would be Vladimir Nabokov's 1955 novel Lolita, which is a story about a child molester, child rapist, Humbert Humbert. He marries a woman just so he can have access to her 12-year-old daughter, Dolores, who he calls Lolita. The mom dies, and then he grooms and he rapes Lolita. He gets his comeuppance later in the story. But when you read through it, you see how he has a deceptive way of talking about things. He's been in and out. He talks about being in and out of insane asylums, that his description of things can't be trusted. The way he describes Lolita as seducing him and charming him, the astute reader has to go, no, that's not what's happening here. That's what he's telling himself to justify the evil things that he's doing. When in other cases, he lets the cat out of the bag that this is a little girl, 4'10" in a sock, as he describes her, not someone who is seducing and charming him and reeling him in. But you have to be astute when you're going through things like that. So first person perspective puts you are looking at the story through the eyes of one of the characters. Okay. The second most common one is going to be third person. I'll get to that shortly, but I do need to talk about one that is hardly ever used because it's very, very, very difficult to do. And that would be second person. So first person uses I, third person uses he, she, second person uses you. So second person is you are looking at the story through the eyes of the main character, but the main character is not someone else. The main character is you. You are in the story, and it describes you in that way. So here is the opening of Jay McInerney's 1984 novel, Bright Lights, Big City, which was later made into a film with Michael J. Fox. You're not the kind of guy who would be at a place like this at this time in the morning, but here you are. You cannot say that the terrain is entirely unfamiliar. Although the details are fuzzy, you are at a nightclub talking to a girl with a shaved head. The club is either Heartbreak or the Lizard Lounge. All might come clear if you could just slip into the bathroom and do a little more Bolivian marching powder. Then again, it might not. Cocaine. It's your typical 1980s high-powered novel. 1980s businessmen hitting up cocaine, going to wild parties, stock markets, riding it high, things like that. So second person can be good if there is an interesting character who's a first-person perspective, and the reader might enjoy pretending to be that person, and that they're along for the ride as if they were that person. So McInerney talks about how you might want to be this person who lives this risky life, high gain, possibly high loss, that you might find it fascinating. But it can really come off cheesy, weird, or unenjoyable if it's a character you don't want to get in the eyes of. So in general, that's why you hardly ever see this in novels. It's very, very rare. The closest you'll see second person would be in the old choose your own adventure books. When I was a kid, I loved these books in the school library. It's like, the adventure in the Amazon. If you take the path down the valley, turn to page 52. If you take the path up the mountain, page 63, up the mountain. A giant vulture grabbed you and flew off and dropped you into the gorge. You died. Come on, man. But there were all different kinds of things like that. Some of the old Choose Your Own Adventures, I have a free-for-all on that I did a long, long time ago. How the old ones are really grim. You'd get assassinated by people, or in the science fiction ones, you could end up immortal, trapped in a test tube forever, shrunken down, or just other weird things. But second person, you really can only use it in those Choose Your Own Adventures where it's like you decide the story, things like that. But like I said, first person is very common. The other one, probably even more common than first person, is third person. Third person would be that the perspective on the story that you're reading is someone else who is not involved in the story. It is told from the perspective of someone else who is watching the characters interact. So one of the most common ones would be third person omniscient. And basically, for shorthand, this would be if God is watching the story and is telling you what is happening. Third person omniscient would be the narrator knows all, sees all, knows everything that has happened, will happen, is happening, and even knows what each of the characters is thinking. And so I'll show you that. That would be, here's an example from Frank Herbert's 1965 novel, Dune. The Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohiam sat in a tapestried chair watching mother and son approach. Windows on each side of her overlooked the curving southern bend of the river and the green farmlands of the Atreides family holding. But the Reverend Mother ignored the view. She was feeling her age this morning, more than a little petulant. She blamed it on space travel, an association with that abominable spacing guild and its secretive ways. But here was a mission that required personal attention from a Bene Gesserit with the sight. Even the Padishah Emperor's truthsayer couldn't evade that responsibility when the duty all came. Damn that Jessica, the Reverend Mother thought. If only she'd borne us a girl as she was ordered to do. Jessica stopped 3 paces from the chair, dropping a small curtsy, a gentle flick of left hand along the line of her skirt. Paul gave the short bow his dancing master had taught, the one used when in doubt of another station. Jessica's hand went to Paul's shoulder, tightened there for a heartbeat, fear pulsed through her palm. Then she had herself under control. Thus he has been taught, Your Reverence. What does she fear? Paul wondered. So you notice there what third person omniscient is doing. It's like we're up in heaven looking down on this story and we know what they're thinking, what they're doing, and we're seeing it all. And that can be a great way to tell a story, to really make clear to us what people are thinking, what they are doing. And so you have this very immersive experience in seeing all and knowing all. The downside is that since it's so easy to write this way, people can often write it in horrible ways. I have read, it's such an easy way, it can become a lazy way of writing. I've read books where one's cardinal sin is head hopping, where he thought this, and then she thought that, and then he did this, and he thought that, and we're just hopping around, and we don't have a sense of space and scale, and it can become confusing. Or there's talky. It's a lot of telling me. The narrator gives a bunch of exposition about this fantasy kingdom and how it was created, and what Lord Salvenstein thought, and he loved her, and this and that. It's like, oh, we get it already. A lot of tell more than show. So third person omniscient, it's easy to fall apart in that way. That's why a lot of skilled writers will use a third person, and this is the one that I think I kind of like the most, is third person limited. This is a third person. This would be not if God is watching the story as the point of view, but if a security camera was watching the story. And it's varied, but sometimes you'll have other characters, side characters be the third person point of view. But imagine if you were reading a story and it's just like a security camera was looking at it and telling us what it saw. So this is a style in Dashiell Hammett's 1930 novel, The Maltese Falcon, which was later made into a film. 2 films, I think, actually, but it was made into a film with Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall, I want to say. So in Maltese Falcon, in the novel, it does not talk about what the characters are thinking. You have to deduce what they are thinking based on the descriptions that Hammett gives of the characters and what they are doing, even the expressions on their faces. And that makes it really enjoyable. It's kind of like watching a movie, and you're using your mind. I'm not saying every novel has to be done this way. All the other perspectives are good. But I really enjoy this of trying to discern what people are thinking just based on these descriptions. So here's an excerpt from The Maltese Falcon. Samuel Spade's jaw was long and bony, his chin a jutting V under the more flexible V of his mouth. His nostrils curved back to make another smaller V. His yellow-gray eyes were horizontal. The V motif was picked up again by thickish brows rising outward from twin creases above a hooked nose, and his pale brown hair grew down from high, flat temples in a point on his forehead. He looked rather pleasantly like a blonde Satan. He said to Effie Perrin, by the way, Spade is a detective in San Francisco, as said in the 1920s, and Effie Perrin is his secretary, and he is dragged into a case about trying to find a lost artifact, medieval artifact, the Maltese Falcon. Supposed to, it's worth a ton of money and everybody's after it and people are lying and there's murders that happen and people take the fall for murders or cover it up. And it's a great example of film noir in the Humphrey Bogart version, but it's one of the top 10 crime novels, mystery novels of all time. So he said to Effie Perrin, "Yes, sweetheart?" She was a lanky, sunburned girl whose tan dress of thin woolen stuff clung to her with an effect of dampness. Her eyes were brown and playful in a shiny, boyish face. She finished shutting the door behind her, leaned against it, and said, "There's a girl wants to see you. Her name's Wonderly." "Customer?" "I guess so. You'll want to see her anyway. She's a knockout." "Shoo her in, darling," said Spade. "Shoo her in." Effie Perrin opened the door again, following it back into the outer office, standing with a hand on the knob while saying, "Will you come in, Miss Wonderly?" A voice said, "Thank you," so softly that only the purest articulation made the words intelligible. And a young woman came through the doorway. She advanced slowly, with tentative steps, looking at Spade with cobalt blue eyes that were both shy and probing. She was tall and pliantly slender, without angularity anywhere, and her body was erect, her legs long, her hands and feet narrow. She wore 2 shades of blue that had been selected because of her eyes. The hair curling from under her blue hat was darkly red, her full lips more brightly red. White teeth glistened in the crescent of her timid smile. Spade rose, bowing and indicating with a thick-fingered hand the oaken armchair beside his desk. He was quite 6 feet tall. The steep, rounded slope of his shoulders made his body seem almost conical, no broader than it was thick, and kept his freshly pressed gray coat from fitting very well. Miss Wonderly murmured, "Thank you," softly as before, and sat down on the edge of the chair's wooden seat. So notice here, you don't have to say she's scared and nervous. Now it does talk about her tone being timid, but even like talking about her posture, how she sits, sitting at the edge of one's seat, like how a child might sit, being very soft-spoken. Whereas Spade, the detective, exhibits this kind of confidence, and the physical description of him gives you that he's kind of I would say that it's very. Humphrey Bogart was a perfect casting for this. It's kind of the proto Harrison Ford, cool, charismatic, tough guy who knows what's going on. The tappity-tap-tap and the thin bell and muffled whir of Effie Perrin's typewriting came through the closed door. Somewhere in a neighboring office, a power-driven machine vibrated dully. On Spade's desk, a limp cigarette smoldered in a brass tray filled with the remains of limp cigarettes. Ragged gray flakes of cigarette ash dotted the yellow top of the desk and the green blotter and the papers that were there. A buff curtained window, 8 or 10 inches open, let in from the court a current of air faintly scented with ammonia. So this description, it's just you're looking at it. It's not just security camera, I guess. It's also smell-o-vision to get into where you are. Miss Wonderly watched the gray flakes twitch and crawl. Her eyes were uneasy. She sat on the very edge of the chair. Her feet were flat on the floor, as if she were about to rise. Her hands in dark gloves clasped a flat, dark handbag in her lap. Spade rocked back in his chair and asked, "Now what can I do for you, Miss Wonderly?" She caught her breath and looked at him. She swallowed and said hurriedly, "Could you? That is..." Then she tortured her lower lip with glistening teeth and said nothing. Only her dark eyes spoke now, pleading. Spade smiled and nodded as if he understood her, but pleasantly, as if nothing serious were involved. He said, "Suppose you tell me about it, from the beginning. Then we'll know what needs doing. Better begin as far back as you can." So it's interesting. I mean, it would be very easy to say Spade thought she was this and that, and the Miss Wonderly thought Spade was blah, 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 and felt this and that. So I like the extra bit. Now, the descriptions can get out of hand. I know some authors, Steinbeck, the others, who sometimes the descriptions can be just a bit much that you're putting out there. But if it's done in the right scene, it's I think a rule of writing. I mean, I have a fiction book I worked on 10 years ago and I abandoned it. I would like to return to it at some point. I really would. But like I do with my nonfiction books, I'd say with my fiction book, every word matters. Every word matters. Treat every word as being precious. So don't overuse words when you don't have to. Stunken White's Elements of Style, their rule: omit unnecessary words. So that's first, second, and third person, third being omniscient and limited POV. Lots of different books that use these. What's your favorite point of view in literature? Have you read any good books lately? I've had a lot that I've gone through. A third person one, let me think off the top of my head. Third person I've gone through. Kafka's Metamorphosis. Gregor Samsa woke up one day and he was a bug. Like, without having to go into his head, I'm a bug. What's going on here? Third person works well there. Third person is used also in stories where first person wouldn't work as well, like Call of the Wild. So Jack London, basically about a dog named Buck that gets kidnapped, taken up to Alaska, and he learns about his primeval roots, goes, with the wolves and stuff. The third person tells us a little bit what Buck is thinking, but it's more bringing out from his actions and saying, Buck didn't like this or that, but not like Buck's like, ruff, ruff, I don't like this at all, And so it's neat to make the dog a character, and the third person makes it not cheesy. It's not like Air Bud or something, for a dog to be the main character or something. What else have I been going through? A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. So that would be... Okay, I looked it up here on Cliff Notes because I was wondering, why can't I fully remember A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich? Why can't I remember the POV very clearly? It's kind of a combination, and some of these there are combinations. So it was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I'm sorry, I'm butchering that for my Russian listeners. It says here, he used a form of narration which is an ingenious variation of a traditional Russian narrative form, the skaz. This technique, employed widely in Russian folktales, establishes an anonymous narrator who is on the same educational and social level as the protagonist and is able to transmit the main character's actions and thoughts using the third person singular and sometimes the first person plural, but giving the impression to the reader that the story is being told in first person by the protagonist. Indeed, in One Day, the reader has the impression that Ivan is the narrator, and only a closer look reveals that most of the story is told in third person. The reader sees through Ivan's eyes, although Ivan is not the narrator. Well, look at that. I was just thinking, I just read the book. I was confused. Like, wait, was it first or was it third person? I genuinely couldn't remember, whereas other books, it's just very clear to me. And that is why, because it's a hybrid storytelling that it kind of filters first person through a very special kind of third person narrator. So there you go. Literature. Ain't it great? And maybe once I get through a few more stories, I'll do another free-for-all on the favorite books I've been reading so far. Laura says I should maybe do a book club with people, maybe with my patrons. I don't know. It might be fun at some point. I'm not sure, but we'll see. Well, thank you guys so much for listening with me, and I hope you have a blessed weekend, and maybe pick up a good book and see what perks your interest.
Great books to add to your 2025 reading list as you learn to defend your faith. That is Counsel of Trent, brand new to the podcast family at EWTN.com/podcast. You can also subscribe wherever you like to stream so you can catch future episodes. I am Ace McKay. We're going to take a quick break, but when Catholics Coast to Coast returns, another new podcast, Shameless Popery. It is a witty yet entertaining podcast that helps to inform our Catholic faith on how we can equip ourselves, that helps to explain Catholicism, and then how we can explain that to others. We're learning a lot this week. So as we dive in, Joe is going to explain how we are, as Catholics, how are we Christians? So what does that mean as we explain ourselves to others, and then get set for more with Shameless Popery on this week's Catholics Coast to Coast.
The destination for great Catholic audio programming is EWTN Podcast Central, featuring the best of EWTN radio, as well as faith-filled podcasts from our friends and affiliates across the nation, all in one place, all free. If it's central to the faith, you can find it on EWTN Podcast Central. It's like podcast heaven. Visit EWTN.com/radio/podcasts today.
Welcome back to Shameless Popery. I'm Joe Heschmeyer. And first of all, I want to apologize for my voice. I think I'm losing it. But second, I wanted to approach today the question of how to answer the question around, are Catholics Christian? And as a Catholic, obviously I think the answer to that is yes. But I think I can give some basic principles to help both Catholics and Protestants who might be facing this question, either wondering it as a Protestant or being confronted with it as a Catholic. Recently, a Protestant YouTuber by the name of Marlon Wilson, whose show I've been on before, asked his overwhelmingly Calvinist, I think, audience if they considered Roman Catholics Christians. There weren't a ton of people who replied, but of those who did, fewer than half were willing to say for sure that we were. I asked Marlon his own views, and he actually argued Catholics were not Christians. Now, if you're a Protestant Christian, you've probably never been in this situation. I've never heard anyone ask, are Methodist Christians, even though we might disagree about some important questions. Unless, they genuinely don't know what a Methodist is. But this happens frequently enough by well-meaning ignorant Protestants that, in fact, while I was putting this video together, a patron on my Patreon, shamelessjoe.com, shared that when he told his own mother that he was going to become Catholic, she said just kind of casually that he wouldn't be a Christian anymore. So today, as I sort of hinted, I want to address two groups of people. Number one, Catholics, to know better how to react if you find yourself in this situation of somebody saying this to you. And number two, Protestants, honestly, so you don't embarrass yourself by making these kind of claims without having a better understanding of what you're talking about. And I want to say that in love, honestly. Before I address 3 ways I think we should respond to the question, I want to talk about 2 ways that we shouldn't. And here I certainly have Catholics in view for don't do this. Don't get defensive, first of all. Because it's really easy to have a kind of emotional speed bump. Understandably, right? It's a tall order for me to tell you don't get defensive when somebody's making a very insulting accusation about you. Being told that you're not a Christian, as a Christian, is about the worst thing somebody could say about you. So, just imagine someone making a very insulting declaration about your character and about your person. You're naturally going to want to defend yourself, and you're probably going to get emotionally fired up and everything else. Again, I understand that. I empathize with that. But I would nevertheless tell you, watch out for that because I don't think it's productive. I would encourage you to remember 5 things. Number 1, remember the other person's awkwardness. Now, put yourself in their shoes because chances are you've found yourself having to confront a brother or sister about something. Maybe it's a sin, or maybe it's just something of a non-moral character. Say, for instance, you got a friend who just smells really bad. And as a friend, you gotta say something. That's an uncomfortable situation for both of you, right? You didn't want this. And so the least helpful thing to do in that kind of situation is to get defensive in a way that just increases the awkwardness. Instead, move against that. Try to dispel the awkwardness. Be gracious about it, even if you've been insulted unjustly. Second, recognize the other person's good intentions. When Marlon shared his theory about why he didn't think Catholics were Christians, he was quick to say, I say this with love. And you know what? I believe him. I think he's wrong in what are some pretty obvious ways, but I also believe his motives are pure and maybe even holy. And so I don't want to knock that too much, right? I think he is misguided, not malicious. Now, with all of this, you can imagine another kind of set of examples. Maybe the person isn't telling you you smell because they're your friend and they love you. Maybe they're telling you you smell because they don't like you and they're being malicious. I'm not talking about that, right? I'm talking about the person who, whether they're right or wrong, tells you, I think you're in error. I think you're in sin. I think you're not a Christian. I think you smell. Whatever it is. In that situation, don't get defensive, even if you know they're wrong. Even if you know they're wrong. Because you want to respond by recognizing the bravery, honestly, that it took them to confront you and the awkwardness that they've kind of created for themselves as well as for you, and their good intentions for being willing to undergo what they knew would be an unpleasant situation for your good. That's something to respect and to honor, right? And that leads then naturally to that third thing. It's much easier, remember this, it's much easier for them to have just talked about you behind your back. On more than one occasion, I had this happen at a Protestant wedding. I had this happen in a Bible study where I was the only Catholic. I've encountered situations where Protestants have said stuff about Catholics not being Christians, and then they find out I'm Catholic, and then they get really awkward because they didn't want to say that to a Catholic. They wanted to say it about Catholics. I get that. Sometimes you have an awkward situation where, I don't know if I can go to this wedding. You want to talk to somebody else is kind of on the same page. But I don't really have a ton of respect for that. Meaning, I don't have a ton of respect for it when you talk ill of others behind their back while being too cowardly to confront them head on. Now, it's fine if you're just saying, help me understand this situation. I'm not speaking about that. But someone who's convinced Catholics aren't Christians, and both of the cases I'm thinking about in my own life, that was the case. They weren't asking, they were declaring. But then they didn't want to declare it to a Catholic. They wanted to declare it to other Calvinists. That sort of thing, I think, whether you're Catholic or Protestant, we should recognize is clearly unchristian. Like, that is not what we're called to do as Christians. There's a model for how you approach when a brother is erring. There's a model for how you confront error and all of this, and that's not it. And so when someone comes to you, appreciate the fact that they didn't take the easy road. They did the harder thing of coming to you. The fourth thing, remember how Jesus responded to insulting and false accusations. In John chapter 8, Jesus' opponents claimed he wasn't really Jewish. They call him a Samaritan and a demoniac. That is at least as insulting as being told that you're not a Christian, right? Like, if I said you're not a Christian and also you're possessed by the devil, okay, I've made that already insulting accusation even worse. And so Jesus could have easily and even justly responded with outrage, but he doesn't do that. In response to the claim that the King of the Jews isn't really a Jew, we find him responding with grace and humility, but also defending himself, directly addressing their objection, telling them they're wrong, but without getting defensive, defending without defensiveness. And that's the model we should be following here. And fifth and finally, we want to recognize that defensiveness tends to shut a conversation down. If you seem too sensitive to handle criticism, other people are less likely to criticize you to your face. They'll continue to think negative things about you. They might even share negative things about you to other people, but they're not going to confront them to you in a way where you could change or correct the record or have a helpful conversation. And so that kind of defensiveness is really counterproductive for them and for you, because you can't clarify things. And so it's a bad outcome all around, right? They just come away thinking you're not a Christian. You come away oblivious to the fact that people are saying that kind of thing about you. That's a problem, right? And so, in all of this, I'm absolutely assuming the best. I'm assuming the person who tells you, I don't think Catholics are Christians, is acting out of a spirit of Christian charity, albeit misguided. You will find people who are bitter or defensive or, just spiteful or trolling or whatever. I'm not talking about those cases. If you don't know, if you're not sure which categories a person's in, you would do well to assume that they're doing it charitably. Assume, in other words, the best motives. And we're going to get more into this in a little more depth kind of as we go. Okay, so that's the first thing not to do. Like, don't get defensive. Second, and this is maybe more surprising, I would suggest don't debate the finer points of their theological objection. Now, I realize that probably sounds completely counterintuitive. And this is, I'm speaking very generally here. I would make exceptions to this if you're, a trained theologian or debater, apologist, whatever. If you know a particular subject matter really well and somebody confronts you about it, if you're, just finished your dissertation on the topic and somebody spouts off something about how Catholics aren't Christians and then they mention your dissertation topic, fine, have at that. But ordinarily, that's not what's going on, right? Like, ordinarily, it's a case where you weren't expecting to have to defend why you're a Christian, and the person confronting you has a whole set of theological ideas that are wrong, or at least wildly different than your own, and there's a lot of work to do to even come to any kind of common understanding. So, oftentimes, and I'll focus on this throughout this video for what I think are going to be clear reasons, when Protestants claim Catholics aren't Christians, it is, I think, more often than not, based on the idea that we interpret St. Paul's epistles to the Romans and to the Galatians in a different way than they do. When St. Paul says that we are justified by faith and not by works of the Mosaic law, we think that means that we're justified by faith and not by works of the Mosaic law. They think that means we're justified by faith alone, apart from anything other than faith. Now, quite frankly, you can read either of those in the text. Both of those can make sense of Paul's writings to the Romans or Galatians. We'll get into more of why that matters, right? And so just to give a couple examples of this kind of coming up, John Bice, he is the founder of G3, which is like the G3 conference is one of the largest evangelical conferences in the U.S. It draws, thousands of people. And so he's a pretty big deal. And he wrote a piece in 2023 about why he thinks Catholics aren't Christians. And I'm going to take a closer look at that in a few minutes here. But very much at the heart of it, it's this idea that, we believe in salvation by faith, but not salvation by faith alone. So he acknowledges we believe in the necessity of faith, but not alone. Now, strikingly, that word alone famously is not in St. Paul's letters. The only time you see faith alone as a phrase is in James 2, where James explicitly says we're not justified by faith alone. Fine. We can get into that whole deep dive. I'm actually not going to do that, and for this simple reason. If you try to get into the deep dive about why this distorts St. Paul's theology, why it pits Paul against St. James, and so on, there is a time and place for that. A formal debate or another avenue where both of you have had time to research and prepare and all of that. But it's probably not going to be in the context where you're being told you're not a Christian. It's just probably not going to be the time to have the formal debate. But there's also a more foundational thing that I'm surprised more people don't talk about. And that's this. The word Catholic, right? It means universal. We have the whole, and we have the whole with all the pieces working together. And so it always feels confusing and complicated for people who have a simpler heretical system. And I don't mean that, again, pejoratively. I just mean that descriptively, because nearly every major Christian heresy works in the same basic way. Number one, there's a fixation. You fixate on a particular part of Scripture, whether that's a particular book or a few books, or whether it's a particular doctrine or theme. That's number one. You take apart from the whole. Number two, you then interpret it in a way contrary to the way it's been traditionally understood by Christians. So you make the whole thing about the Mosaic Law, or justification by faith alone, or predestination, or speaking in tongues, or fill in the blank. It all works the same way. You interpret it in a way where, you have to, speak in tongues to be truly saved. That sort of thing, right? Like, what are they doing? They're taking a theme, speaking in tongues, which is in Scripture, and then they're interpreting it in a way that isn't the traditional understanding of that doctrine. You can do this across the board. Then, number three, you then interpret the rest of Scripture either through the lens of your fixation, or you just kind of ignore the rest of Scripture. You talk about justification by faith alone and how all that you need for salvation is faith and just that's all that matters. And then you get these uncomfortable passages like Jesus' separation of the sheep and goats, where he talks about the judgment of the world and he looks at what people don't do in terms of their works. And he doesn't even mention faith. And you just kind of gloss over those parts. You just kind of ignore them. Or you say, well, obviously he's presupposing faith, and this is just the outgrowth of that faith. So even though he doesn't mention faith, he really meant the sheep are those who have faith and the goats are those who don't. You reinterpret all the passages in these often very counterintuitive ways through the lens of your presuppositions because of your fixation. That's how almost every heresy works. This is also, by the way, how plenty of other things that aren't theological work, like conspiracy theories. It's you take a fixation about one thing and you make it kind of a grand idea through which you view the rest of reality. Now, the temptation in these cases is to attack the fixation, to say, I'm going to debate you about why your fixation is wrong. No, you shouldn't read the whole of Scripture through law and gospel. No, you shouldn't read the whole of Scripture through dispensational theology. No, you shouldn't read the whole of Scripture through like a restorationist lens. That's tempting. That is usually folly for a few reasons. The chief reason is because this is their fixation and not yours. They've probably read a lot more than you have. It doesn't mean they're right, but it does mean it's going to be much easier for them to surprise you with some chapter and verse you didn't remember than for you to do the same for them. There are exceptions to this. I've encountered times, I had a time where I had a Protestant street preacher tell me, you won't find anything in the Bible that says baptism saves. And then I had him read 1 Peter 3:21 with me in his own Bible, and he was flummoxed for a second. But then he said, well, 1 Peter wasn't written to Christians, it was written to Jews. Okay. So even then, he found a way to reinterpret it according to his fixation. That sort of thing is why attacking the fixation directly usually doesn't work. There is a better way. I'm going to address the better way in a moment. But I would just say this in general. So debating someone who is really fixated on sola fide is usually not the way the ordinary Christian should go about it. But this is true across the board. You've got some Protestants believe that we all need to be keeping the Sabbath on Saturday. And I'll bet they know the verses about the Sabbath more readily than you do. Mormons who are convinced that Amos 8 predicts the great apostasy. It doesn't, but I bet they know Amos 8 better than you do. You got, even let's take opposite examples, right? You got on the one hand, Oneness Pentecostals. They believe Jesus and the Father are just different names or roles for the same divine person. So they don't believe in one God, three persons. They believe in one God, one person. Then you have the Jehovah's Witnesses, almost the opposite, where they believe that Jesus and Father are not the same person, but in fact, they're not even the same being, that God the Father is God and Jesus is not God. Now, obviously, those two things can't both be true. Jesus can't both be the Father and not be God at all. And we would say both of them are actually false. But here's the thing. I would venture that ordinary Trinitarian Christians, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, confronted with a Oneness Pentecostal or Jehovah's Witness, will find themselves kind of frantic and scrambling, because those guys are used to having to defend their non-Trinitarian theology way more than most Christians are prepared to defend Trinitarian theology, because we're not constantly attacked on it, right? Like, if you're a non-Trinitarian who believes you're a Christian, you're used to hearing Trinitarians tell you, we don't even think you're a Christian because you don't believe in the Trinity. It's so foundational precisely for that reason. They often know those verses better. So again, I want to be completely clear. There is a time and place to debate the fixation. And there are people who, even off the cuff, have the theological, rhetorical, apologetic kind of skills to do that immediately. That is not all of us. And so you have enough self-knowledge to know, am I finding myself being sucked into a debate on a topic I wasn't prepared for and they were? Because that's probably not going to go well. And that doesn't mean that you don't believe the right thing. You can be right, and that's still the case. So, having said all that, that's what not to do. You might then wonder, okay, well, then what in the world am I supposed to do? So let's talk about that. Number one, seek to understand why. Now, I'll acknowledge this is not as much fun as just immediately bashing people over the head, but this is way more important. It's way more productive. You'll never answer their objections to Catholicism and why they think we're not Christian if you don't first understand what they even think Catholics believe. And so allow them to present their own view on what Catholics believe. Now, along the way, you should keep two important distinctions in mind. Number one, recognize the difference between saying, I disagree with the Catholic Church's teaching on X, and the much bolder claim, anyone who believes the Catholic Church's teaching on X isn't even a Christian. Now, we can maybe understand why someone doesn't see the wisdom of the Church's teaching on XYZ doctrine. And so, people who think Catholics aren't Christians tend to just want to debate the merits of who's right on justification, who's right on, the role of tradition or the role of the Church or the necessity of baptism or whatever. But that's all at that first level. I disagree with the Catholic Church on these issues. But if you're going to say the Catholic Church isn't Christian, you have to say the second thing, that anyone who disagrees with my reading of Scripture as a Protestant doesn't even get to count as a Christian. So if you're going to tell me that I have to not just agree with St. Paul on justification, which I do to the best of my knowledge, I also have to agree with your interpretation of Paul, you got to tell me why. So as a Catholic listening, you want to be listening for two things. Number one, what do they think Catholics believe? And number two, are they giving you reasons why you have to agree with them in order to be Christian? Chances are you're going to find a very fruitful amount of errors in the first thing to have a fruitful conversation. And we'll get into what to do next in a second. But there's a second important distinction. Because look, remember, if this person isn't just like a total troll, chances are they're very uncomfortable with the fact that they've sort of said, you're going to hell, right? They've just said you're not a Christian. And so they're going to want to quickly backtrack and create an escape hatch, because it's pretty clear in Christianity that we're not to just be like judging and condemning other people to hell all the time. And so they'll say, well, maybe you're saved in some way. So we want to keep this distinction in mind as well. It's great that they acknowledge that maybe you're going to heaven, but that's not the question. The question here isn't whether some Catholics are going to heaven or not. It's great that we can agree on that. The question is whether the Catholic Church is Christian. Notice what happens. First, you're keeping the topic clear. You're not wandering off course. But second, it forces a conversation, not just about theology, but about what a church even is. And I'll tell you, historically, Protestants are very, very weak on having given much thought to even what it means to be the church, or having looked at what Scripture says about the idea of the church. So already, just by keeping the question in view, we're not talking about the individual salvation of an individual believer known only to God. We're talking about whether the Catholic Church is a true church, whether the Catholic Church is Christian. Notice the difference there. You're not going to be able to solve number one. Maybe the person has a deathbed conversion. You don't know. Maybe the person says all the right things, but in their heart, they secretly deny God. You don't know those things, right? God alone knows those things. That's not going to be a productive conversation. But you can have the conversation of where is the church described in the Bible? Or what does it even mean to be a Christian? Those conversations are objective. They're external. We can have those kind of discussions. So then the second thing to do after you listen is to gently correct. Now, I think there's a few things to bear in mind here. The first is called Hanlon's razor. Never prescribe to malice what could also be attributed to stupidity. Now, I say this because as soon as this person lays out their case about what Catholics believe and why, overwhelmingly, in my experience, it takes very little time for you to start hearing these wild distortions of Catholic theology, these outright errors and falsehoods. I'm going to give some examples in a second here. When that happens, don't assume they're being malicious. Now, I know Hanlon's razor says stupidity. It's sufficient to say ignorance. We don't even have to assume they're stupid, because even smart people find themselves in situations where they don't understand what other people believe. It's hard enough to accurately describe your own beliefs to somebody else. It's much harder to accurately describe their beliefs to them. This is true whether we're talking about theology or, if you were to say, hey, describe this other culture. Chances are your description of another country, culture, whatever, is not going to be the same way people understand their own culture, their own country, whatever, right? You're going to probably get some things wrong. And that's fine. That's grounds for a good conversation. And this happens, by the way, in both directions. I've heard Catholics who, grew up Catholic describing what Protestants believe as if Protestants are a monolith in ways that are often really cringe-inducing. And I try not to do that. I've had times where I've said things about, such and such Protestant group where I've realized later, like, oh, that wasn't a very good way of describing that, or I got that detail wrong or whatever. So even when you're trying your best, even when you're a person of goodwill and you've put some time and effort into understanding, mistakes are going to happen in both directions.
Answering the questions for effectively defending and explaining our faith. Great stuff from a new podcast, Shameless Popery. Check it out when you get some time at Podcast Central, EWTN.com/podcast, and check it out on demand as well. That way the app is with you wherever you like to stream. I am Ace McKay, bugging out, going home. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. You want the most of what's happening in podcast and also extras. Check us out. EWTN Extra gives you more of that on a daily basis. I'll see you next time. Remember, let God define who you are, and I'll see you again with Catholics Coast to Coast.